Okay, today's lesson is going to be over safety legislation, and we're going to go over legislative history and how the OSHA Act actually came into play. When we start looking at legislative history, we're looking at different types of regulations that were kind of put together. And one of the ways that they actually came across was the British were actually the first person who created any type of regulations. And what they said was, okay, we see that all of these people are being hurt. A lot of them were children at that point in time, and we need to do some regulations with regard to this. Now, in the United States, what happened is a lot of the media started writing a lot of stories about people getting hurt, and they pretty much demanded that the government do something about this. And what this caused was we started looking at early legislation to kind of go into act, and then it ended up in 1970 that the OSHA Act was actually put into play. Now, when we start looking at this until about 1970, there really was no uniform or any type of comprehensive plan or standard to protect any of the Americans that were out there. And there were about 14,000 worker deaths, and about 2.2 workers were disabled at this point in time. And there were, all of these things kind of went into play. And so when they made the act, one of the things that they said was to assure, so far as every possible working man and woman in the nation, a safe and healthful working conditions to preserve our human resources. So then you start looking at the act itself, and it does have some things in there. It's just not a bunch of standards that we have to follow, but there are some other things. Now, one of the things that it did, it reduced workplace hazards and implemented a new and improved existing health and safety programs. And so it also provided for research, and this was in occupational safety and health. And what they wanted was to develop innovative ways of dealing with occupational safety and health problems. Now, they did want to also establish responsibilities and rights for both the employer and employees, and they wanted to make sure they maintain a reporting and record keeping system to monitor all of the job related injuries and illnesses. They also wanted to establish training programs to increase the number and competence of occupational safety and health personnel, and develop a mandatory job safety and health standards and enforce them. And that's mainly what they're known for, is that one right there. They also wanted to provide for any type of development, evaluation, approval of state programs throughout the United States. Now, when we start looking at the OSHA standards, they're actually broken out into different volumes. And volume 1 is actually general industry, standards and interpretation. Volume 2 is maritime. Volume 3 is construction. Volume 4, when we start looking at that, is other regulations and procedures. So it's something that's not listed under the three that I just listed. Now, the field operations manual and the technical manual, those are used by OSHA themselves when they go out to do investigation. And I also wanted to mention that Volume 1 includes agricultural. So when we look to see who's actually covered, this is pretty much all employees in the DC, Puerto Rico, and other territories that are under federal jurisdiction. Now, there are some exceptions, and this is an exception to the whole OSHA overview. If you're self employed and you are just the only person that works for you, then you don't have to follow OSHA. The other thing is family farms, and that's specific to families who have farms, and the only employees that actually work on the farm are family members. And then the last one is other federal agencies. Now, there are some exceptions to programs, and we'll talk about those as the programs come along, but if you have 10 or less employees, you do not have to do those programs, but you still have to follow OSHA regulations regardless if you have 10 or less employees, except for the three that I just mentioned. Now, this is kind of where OSHA standards came into play, and there's three different ways that they came into play. The first one is consensus standards, and this was developed by industry-wide standards. And what they did is they looked at organizations like National Fire Protection Association or that's NFPA, or maybe the ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. And these were already standards that were in play and they were agreed upon, so they decided they were just going to develop those into their standards. The second one was proprietary standards. And what they did is they actually looked at a bunch of professional experts within specific industries or professional societies or associations, and they said, do you agree with this? And it was determined by membership vote. The third way was pre existing federal laws, and this was just laws that were already in existence and enforced by OSHA, and they said, okay, we need to go ahead and just stick these under there. And a couple examples of that would be the Federal Supply Contracts Act, the Contract Workers Hours, and the Safety Standards Act. Now, to understand when you look up, say, the standards, exactly what each area is, 29 is the title. CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations, is what that stands for. 1910 is the part. 110 is the section. Where it says paragraph, that is the parentheses B, parentheses 13. And then you have the bulleted items, and then it goes through numeric. And one of the things on the OSHA page, when you do list something out as a standard, typically you don't say 29 CFR 1910 blah blah blah. You just say 1910.110B and then to do that. But do make sure that you are putting your parentheses in there correctly, and your period in between the 1910 and 110 when listing something out. Okay, the subparts kind of are as follows, and I'm not going to read through these because you can pretty much read through these yourself. This is for 1910 general industry. Now, if you look in 1926, some of these changed, so do make sure when you are looking up information with regard to subparts for any type of quiz or any type of worksheet that you may have, that you are looking up in 1910 general industry. Now there were some specific requirements of the act that were out there, and what they did is they actually put responsibilities with regard to employers and employees. Now the employers' responsibilities were knowing the standards that fit their establishment, and so they actually have to go through, and even though there's thousands and thousands of standards, they're responsible for knowing those standards that are specific to their facilities. Now, the next one is that OSHA does make the assumption that all employers are knowledgeable with regard to the standards. So it's the kind of the thing where if you were speeding, the officer comes and stops you and you say, I don't know what the speed limit is, and it's kind of like, so what? OSHA's kind of that way too. You have to know what the standards are that apply to you. And then the other thing is that it is the employer's responsibility to make sure that the employee complies with the standards appropriately. Now, owners have the responsibility to ensure also too that all employees are aware of the regulations, and employees must comply with the rules and regulations, and then they have to make sure that they are aware of them through the employers and the owners, but they also have to make sure that they are complying with those. Now, just to kind of go through, here are some of the things that employers must do with regard to their rights. And they do have to make sure that they go out and inspect the workplace, that they do something with regard to minimizing or reducing risk. And typically, those are going to be your three hazard controls that we talk about: your engineering, your administrative, and PPE. If they cannot totally get rid of a hazard, they have to use some type of device or labeling in order to identify potential hazards. They have to provide the training to the employees and maintain records with regard to those, as well as accidents and other information. And then if employees need or want, they have to provide access to medical records. Now, when you are in an inspection, employers can actually ask, okay, what is the reason of this inspection? it is also their right as an employer to walk around with the officer during that inspection. And that's something that I would really suggest, to make sure that you're walking around, taking pictures, taking notes, and all of that. The other thing is, as an employer, you may have some type of confidential or trade secret, and the OSHA compliance officer will actually recognize this and not put that information or take pictures with regard to that. Now, in the employee responsibility we talked about, they must comply with all the standards, but they also too have the right to ask excuse me, ask for safety or tell someone that there's something that's unsafe on the job without fear of punishment. And we talked about that previously, and if you recall, that's under the Whistleblower Act or 11C. Now, they can exercise their rights under OSHA, which were those rights that were listed on the OSHA poster that we'd looked at, and they also can take their employer to court if they feel like they're being discriminated against for exercising any of these rights. Now, the general duty clause we talked about previously states that each employer shall furnish to his employees employment in a place of employment which is free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees. Now, this can be found under Section 5A. Now, when we start peeling back, and OSHA, one of those things that everybody was talking about, okay, well, what's a recognized hazard? So OSHA went through and they said, okay, a recognized hazard can be either detectable by senses or instrumentation, that it's common knowledge that this is out there. When I'm walking around, I can actually see it if I'm doing some type of inspection, and the employer also has knowledge of that. And those are the four things that make it a recognizable hazard. Now, when you start looking at inspections, and we've talked about this, and so I'm not going to go through this, but just know that the priority of the inspections are imminent danger, fatality, catastrophe, complaints and referrals, and program inspections. Now, I also mentioned when we talked about it in the intro to OSHA that there was a fifth one that was out there, and it's not actually published, but it is something that it would be a follow-up inspection, and they would actually come back and look at any of these that are listed here and say, okay, did you do what you were supposed to do? Were your changes effective? And so that's kind of the fifth unwritten inspection. Now, when we start looking at the inspection process, the Act actually provides that the OSHA inspector, when they come, they need to make sure that they show you their credentials. And they also expect to be actually allowed on site, immediately without any type of delay. Now, they do understand that there are some circumstances where a safety professional may not be available. And so what they do is they actually say, all right, well, that's fine, but, maybe you start doing something so that they don't feel like they're delayed, or you have a contingency plan in case the safety professional is not there and you do have an OSHA inspection. Now, normally the inspections are offered probably in the 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock hour until 5 or 6, typically, because they're wanting to go home as well. But if you do have some different hours or something like that, they're going to arrange for them to be there. You will have an opening and closing conference, and what this does is it allows the employer to ask questions and understand why the person's there and what was found when they were there. Now, the OSHA consultant's actually going to look at documents and records. They're probably going to then take a tour with regard to this. And then what the inspector is going to do is actually record anything that he's found. But at the same time, once again, you need to be recording this on your own. During the closing conference, they'll actually go over which ones they are going to cite you for. And they're not going to assign any type of penalties or anything, and they're not going to give you the paperwork right then and there typically. They're going to take it back, prepare the report, and then send it on to you. Now, we've already talked about the citations and penalties, so I'm not going to go over this slide, but just kind of know what these are and what the premise is of this. Now, the appellate process, let's say that you do get some citations, and you get this note, and it says that I'm going to charge you $30,000 for everything that you've done wrong. And there's a list of what it is, and it says what type of violation it is. You do have 15 days from the date that you receive the citation to submit any objections in writing. Now, if you miss that day of 15 days, it doesn't make a difference. They're not going to go back and say, oh, that's okay, or something like that. You just have to pay the whole fee. Now, let's say that you do an appeal, and what happens is it goes to the area director within the region that you're in, and then if they can't still decide on any type of appeal process, it goes to the review commission, and then finally it can go on to the appeals court. Now, I've also put this up there for you previously just to kind of see some of those state plans that are out there. And so if you are in a state approved program, it is going to be equal to or more stringent than the federal OSHA. And what they have to do is actually petition, the state actually has to petition OSHA and say, hey, I would like to have a state plan, and this is what my plan is. Now, we're actually here in Kansas and Missouri, I'll pick both of those. We're both in Region 7, and in Kansas, we are actually covered under the Kansas Department of Human Resources. Now, the other two names that you'll kind of know, and I'll mention quite a bit throughout, is NIOSH and the NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and then OSHRC is the Review Commission. Now, what NIOSH does is they're the research arm of OSHA, and then the Review Commission reviews all the appeals. Okay, I did put two websites down here. One of them is OSHA.gov and the other is CalORonline.com. And if you do want to get on CalORonline.com and get some more information, we do have some passwords, and all you need to do is just send me an email and contact me. So if you have any other questions, let me know. Thank you.